On a cold autumn evening, the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. The wind whispered through the trees, and in his room, 12-year-old Oliver lay in his bed, cocooned beneath his thick blanket. The walls of his small room were dimly lit by the soft glow of the nightlight near his bed, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the wooden floorboards. For weeks, Oliver had been struggling with an unusual fear that had become a nightly companion: sleep paralysis. He had felt its grip many times before, an invisible weight pressing down on him, holding him captive between the world of dreams and waking life. But tonight something felt different. As his breathing slowed and he drifted into sleep, the familiar sensation began to creep over him. His chest tightened, his body became leaden, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't move. He was locked in place, paralyzed in his own body. It was the same terrifying feeling he had come to expect, yet there was a chilling undertone to the air tonight. Oliver fought against the paralysis, his mind racing. He willed his body to move, but as always, it refused. Panic rose within him as he lay frozen, his senses heightened, aware of every sound, every shift in the shadows. He had grown used to this battle, but he knew something was off this time. His heart hammered in his chest. And then, to his surprise, his eyes slowly fluttered open. He wasn't supposed to be able to open them, not during sleep paralysis. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. His gaze fixed on the ceiling above him, and his breath hitched in his throat. The ceiling of his room was made of wooden panels, each piece interlocking with the next in a rustic pattern. But tonight, the grain of the wood seemed to twist and bend in the dim light, forming strange shapes. As he stared, his sleepy brain began to play tricks on him. The wood patterns shifted, contorting themselves into shapes that resembled eyes, dozens of eyes, all staring down at him. Oliver's heart raced as the eyes seemed to come alive, watching him, following his every movement or lack thereof. The more he stared, the more they seemed to move, blinking slowly, as if mocking his paralysis. His breath became shallow, his chest tightening with fear. No, he thought, trying to close his eyes, to shut out the unnerving sight. But the eyes, those countless, unblinking eyes, held him captive. They seemed to bore into him, piercing through his thoughts, deep into his very soul. With a sudden burst of terror, he squeezed his eyes shut. Darkness swallowed him, but his relief was short-lived. In the silence of the room, a sound began to creep in. At first, it was faint, barely a whisper, like a distant murmur. But it grew steadily louder, and soon Oliver could make it out clearly. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Cold, monotone, and deeply unsettling. It was coming from somewhere in the room. His body was frozen, trapped in the grip of sleep paralysis, but his mind was fully awake now, every nerve on edge. The laughter continued, echoing around the room, growing louder with each passing second. It was a hollow, joyless sound, and it filled the space with an eerie tension. The laugh was loud, but flat, devoid of emotion, as though whoever was laughing was doing so out of habit rather than amusement. Oliver's heart pounded in his chest as he forced himself to open his eyes again. Slowly, as if moving through thick syrup, his eyes slid open, and his gaze shifted toward the corner of the room, where the laughter seemed to be coming from. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. At first, he couldn't make out the details. His vision was still blurry from sleep. But as his eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed entirely in white, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, her face obscured by darkness, but the sound of her laughter continued to echo through the room. Oliver wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from the figure, but his body refused to obey him. He could only lie there, helpless, as the woman's laughter grew louder and louder, filling every corner of the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating and oppressive. Oliver blinked, his eyes wet with unshed tears, and before he could fully process what had happened, the next thing he knew, he was sitting upright in bed, sobbing uncontrollably in his mother's arms. The room was bright now, flooded with the soft light of morning. His mother, her face filled with concern, held him tightly, stroking his hair as he cried. He tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. His chest ached from the fear, the confusion, and the lingering terror of the night. "It was just a bad dream," his mother whispered soothingly. "You're safe now. It's over." But Oliver knew it wasn't just a dream. It had felt too real, too vivid. The next morning, as they sat at the breakfast table, Oliver worked up the courage to ask his mother about the night before. His hands trembled as he stirred his cereal, the spoon clinking against the bowl. "Mom," he began cautiously. "What? What happened last night? Did I say anything when I came into your room?" His mother looked up from her cup of coffee, her face thoughtful. She hesitated for a moment before answering, as if choosing her words carefully. "You came into my room crying," she said softly. "You said you had a terrible dream, but there was something else." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You kept saying something about a woman," she continued. "You said you saw a woman, all dressed in white, standing in the corner of your room." Oliver felt a cold chill run down his spine. His mother's words echoed in his mind, each one hitting him like a punch to the gut. "A woman," he repeated, his voice trembling. His mother nodded slowly. "Yes, and you said she was laughing and waving at you." Oliver's stomach twisted into knots. His hands felt clammy, and his heart raced as a memory surged to the forefront of his mind, something he had seen in a YouTube video a few weeks ago. His eyes widened in horror. "Waving," he whispered. "How? How was she waving?" His mother looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "How was she waving?" he repeated, his voice urgent now. "Was she waving with the palm of her hand? Or... His mother frowned, trying to recall the details. "No," she said slowly, her brow furrowed. "She was waving with the back of her hand, like this." She lifted her hand and mimicked the gesture, waving with the dorsal side of her hand facing outwards. Oliver felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Goosebumps prickled his skin, and he struggled to breathe as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. In the YouTube video, the one he had watched late at night, the narrator had talked about ghosts, how they often did things opposite to the way humans did. And one of the examples had been exactly this: ghosts, the narrator had said, would wave with the back of their hand, rather than the palm, as if mimicking human behavior in a twisted, distorted way. Oliver's mouth went dry. His mind raced, piecing together the horrifying truth. The woman in his room hadn't just been part of a nightmare. She had been something else, something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He looked at his mother, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Mom, I think I saw a ghost." His mother stared at him, her face pale. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. And then, without warning, she clapped her hands together hard. But she didn't clap with the palms of her hands. She clapped with the backs. "Wow," she said, her voice low and mocking. "You're so smart." Oliver's blood ran cold. His mother's eyes seemed to glint with something unfamiliar, something that didn't belong. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized, with dawning horror, that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.